Hello! Bethesda just gave us a pretty long Starfield Direct video covering the gameplay features of the game. Obviously the point was to hype up the release of the game in September, so they covered the features pretty broadly. But I thought we saw enough gameplay footage to give us some idea of what to expect in the full release of the game. So let me cover a few things that I noticed. How long a showcase video focuses on a feature tells us quite a lot about what they consider their strengths. And the trailer focused quite a lot on the combat aspects, especially with jetpacks. I'll jump straight to my conclusion and tell you that I'm strongly reminded of Fallout 76. That makes a lot of sense, because Fallout 76 is the most recent Bethesda game where you have guns. And because it's an MMO, you can get a lot of data about how players approach combat. I know many people have strong opinions about Fallout 76, but I'll point out that combat is a strength of the game, and from that perspective my comparison of Starfield with Fallout 76, when it comes to combat, it's not a judgment of how good or bad combat will be. It's pointing out that many features are like those we've seen from previous Bethesda games. The jetpack is also something that you can get from Fallout 76, and it's true that it's one of the coolest aspects of the game. If you also get a couple of mutations, then the jetpack in normal armor is pretty much the gameplay you see in Starfield. One of the biggest differences is that there doesn't seem to be any VATS in personal combat. It does in ship-to-ship combat, but not personal combat. The mix of weapons is also pretty much the same as in Fallout 76. You've got your mix of energy and bullet weapons, and the same variety of pistols, rifles, shotguns, and heavy weapons. The modding will also be very familiar to Fallout players. You can argue that in a universe where everybody has gravitational drives, it doesn't make much sense to have weapons like revolvers still being used. And punching someone to death? Obviously the goal was to give players a variety of ways to approach combat. It's not very logical, but it's been proven to work in their previous titles, and Bethesda does prioritize what they see as the fun factor. It looks like they've also retained the same legendary system as in the Fallouts. Personally, I'm not a fan of this because it's random. One of the things that Fallout 76 did to ameliorate the randomness was to give you massive amounts of legendaries and the ability to trade them in and roll your own. I hope that Starfield will have something that allows you to get the legendaries you want instead of just relying on dumb luck. Ideally it should be something that you can craft yourself, maybe via research. So basically it seems the weapons system will be all about collecting random legendaries, then applying mods you can research, just like in Fallout 76. From a numbers perspective, the game seems to be basically like the Fallouts. You've got the same damage resistance, broken down into 3 different types. Your armor also gives you resistances to environmental factors, which seems to come in when you explore different types of planets. Food also seems to be mostly about healing, though I wouldn't be surprised if some also gives you buffs. They do look very good, and there seems to be a lot of variety, but if all they do is just give you healing, then there might not be much point to this variety. Another feature that the Direct video focuses on quite heavily was base building. You've got 2 types of bases. One is your normal base on a planet. It seems to be focused on providing you resources. This is very similar to workshops and camps in Fallout 76. You set up a small base with automated resource production that you come and collect from every so often. The second type of base is your ship. It seems that you can have a number of them, but the impression I got was that you only get to use one at a time. So it looks like you can't set up anything like an automated trading network. A big difference is that Starfield seems to focus on modules, instead of allowing you to build at the world level like in Fallout. This is probably because of all the issues they've had with getting base building right in the engine, and just doing modules is probably the wise decision to avoid bugs. But it does look like you still get quite a lot of flexibility in how you put those modules together. It might not matter as much when it comes to bases on planets, but because you take ships into combat, how you place your modules will hopefully have a big impact on space combat. We know you can target specific modules in enemy ships, so hopefully you can structurally damage a ship. So let's say that a module connects 2 parts of a ship, then ideally destroying that module will split the ship apart without needing to destroy the entire ship. That would reward players who are good at targeting. A very interesting comment was that planets are procedurally generated on the fly, meaning that everybody gets a unique planet. If the procedural generator works fine, then that would be interesting. The key being the if. Procedural generation is used in many games today, but the final product is usually touched up by hand to make sure it's up to a certain level of quality. Skyrim and Fallout games all had this touching up. From the gameplay footage you can see that there's a variety of environments, and rules have been put in place to make them logical. And because there's a long history of procedural generation for terrain, I'm not too skeptical about those claims, and I think terrain will be alright. What I am worried about is the flora and fauna. The concern is that we haven't seen much variety in the plant life. In a game where you're supposed to be exploring the universe, you can't just have the same old plants that you have here on Earth. It might be that they're there, but didn't have the time to show them, but they did spend very little time on that. Most of the animals we see are either leathery or have shells. Nothing with fur, and this was something I mentioned back in my deep dive of the earlier gameplay trailer. We didn't see small animals that might feed big carnivores. The animals mostly seem to just wander around, though we did see a small glimpse where animals are chasing each other. It seems that the wildlife is there mostly for you to see and fight. I'm concerned that this will get old pretty quickly. The urban landscapes we saw were very focused on the major city. It looks like players are supposed to spend most of the time adventuring there, and space is mostly there for exploring and resource gathering. The city does look great, but we generally only saw the facades. If you get a situation where you can't interact with buildings, then it would undermine the city. It's no good having a pretty looking building if you can't do anything with it. It looks like Bethesda is sticking to its standard approach of having 4 or 5 major factions that you can join or side with. A lot of these factions are almost straight out of different genres. The Japanese corpo faction is straight out of Cyberpunk. You've got Fallout Raiders just in space, Cowboys just in space. On the surface this mix doesn't make sense, and it would be very easy to dismiss a lot of these factions. But I'll point out that you can have quirky or odd factions as long as you justify it. Take the Kings from Fallout New Vegas. On the surface it doesn't make any sense to have a bunch of Elvis impersonators as a faction. But it's feasible because the game takes place in Vegas, where there's a history of Elvis impersonators. And yes, as you might expect, Elvis impersonators don't make for a strong military force. They're just a local militia keeping the peace in the outskirts of Vegas. And as soon as the NCR or the Legion takes over Vegas, they're finished in one way or another. It's all put together in a way that's feasible, which is why I highlighted in a previous video that lore will be the key to Starfield's long-term success as a franchise. It's one thing to provide an open universe for players to play in, it's another for a new franchise to win the hearts and minds of the audience. For an example of what I mean, you can look at the success of Warhammer 40k. You can see that the roots of it were simply taking fantasy races, just in space and with very strong horror overtones. The purpose was to sell miniatures for a tabletop wargame, but what really holds it all together is the lore that's grown up around the original premise. If they can make the cowboys in space justifiable based on the lore, then it would work. Maybe they're an Amish type situation where they reject technology for religious reasons. Unfortunately, based on Bethesda's most recent games, I have to be skeptical because factions haven't been a strength, especially complex relationships between factions. So I expect them to be there to give you a faction to side with, which should make some other factions enemies, and not much more beyond that. Character progression seems pretty similar to what you find in games like Far Cry. Do a thing so many times to rank it up. There's 82 skills total, and if they all have 4 levels, that's 328 level ups to get all skills maxed out. It doesn't look like there's skills that are excluded based on what you have, or what faction or religion you belong to, so presumably you can get all the skills. It looks like they behave like the perk cards in Fallout 76. For example, the Xenosociologist skill is basically the Animal Friendship or Wasteland Whisperer perks from Fallout 76. The boost pack skill is an odd thing to have as a skill in a space game. Anybody who's been on a spacewalk should know what something like a boost pack works like. But as I mentioned previously, the boost pack works just like the jetpack in Fallout 76. One thing that wasn't mentioned was whether the game has level scaling. Most recent Bethesda games have some level scaling baked in, so enemies in an area will have a minimum and maximum levels, but they'll try to match your own level. In Fallout 76 it just worked out pretty easy at the beginning, with the difficulty spike at around level 50, and the enemy is capped at a level 100, so after level 150 or so, you should be mowing down enemies pretty handily. Levels also lost meaning after you maxed out all your perk cards, so a level 500 character is basically as good as a level 1000 character, because level ups only give you perk points. It would be wise to expect something like that in Starfield, but 300 plus levels of skills should be enough to keep people busy, so it'll be a long time before people get bored. Bethesda is not a developer known for having vehicle combat in its games, so spaceship combat will be a new thing. We've already talked about the modular nature of shipbuilding, and how I hope it has an actual effect during combat. It looks like we can have 3 different weapon types installed, and they've taken a leaf out of universes like Star Wars and Star Trek, with the inclusion of energy management on the fly. Your total energy seems to be based on the reactor you've installed on the ship, and individual components cap out how much energy you can supply to them. It looks like you can equip modules that need more energy than your reactor can supply, but with the understanding that you'll have to manage power more carefully depending on the situation. The video doesn't go into how you can use your crew. They have skills, but how do those skills affect the running of the ship? There's hints that you can assign crew members to stations, but no detail on how that affects gameplay. The simple way would be to give you a global bonus. So if you have someone with good piloting skills assigned to the cockpit, then maybe the ship maneuvers faster. Maybe someone with weapon skills makes your weapons do more damage. But a more ideal situation would be to have people acting independently at their stations, maybe based on your orders. So you might choose to pilot the ship while leaving someone with weapon skills to man the lasers. Or you might choose to run engineering and get the most juice out of the reactor, which is then used by the pilot and the weapons crews. We know that the interior of ships will correspond to the modular design you put together. Ideally, you changing stations would involve you physically running through the ship. Another scenario is ship boarding. We know that you can board enemy ships, so it's likely that your own ship can also be boarded. We don't see them in the footage, but having modules designed to repel boarders would be nice to see. Basically, it would be great to see modular shipbuilding actually affect gameplay, and not just there for looks. We don't get to see much of the main quest, but one interesting teaser that was shown is that you seem to be able to gain what looks like magical powers. Presumably this is part of the main quest, and it hints at the player being the chosen one like in Skyrim, and you'll get the space equivalent of dragon shouts to use against enemies. So what do I think? Starfield is definitely aiming for the stars, pun intended. The gameplay is going to try and cater for pretty much everybody. Do you like exploring? There's 1,000 planets for you to look at. Do you like base building? Yeah, here's how you can customize to your heart's desire. Do you like combat? Here's a jetpack and a bunch of different weapons. Do you like Easter eggs? Yeah, the adoring fan is back.
Is it really you? I've got to have every molecule.
There's still questions about how deep the gameplay is, and questions about whether the lore of the universe will engage players. But from what we saw, Starfield is ambitious and promising. It definitely looks like players like what they see. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments. Feel free to leave a like, subscribe and hit the bell button to be notified when new videos come out. See you soon.